Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for being a part of this panel talking about the spiritual and emotional effects of living through a fire or a national disaster. My name is Laura Nelson. I'm currently serving as the president of the Fort Collins Area Interfaith Council and also working with the Long-Term Recovery Group, which is a group of volunteer agencies helping with recovery from the Cameron Peak and Larimer County part of the East Troublesome Fire, but I imagine that much of what we'll say will feel applicable to folks experiencing other disasters or other fires throughout the country. I know dear friends of mine lost their home to one of the fires in Oregon, and so really the whole fire season we all went through last summer is on my heart as we move into spring and summer again. I had the great privilege of sitting on a panel, listening to the wisdom from my three wonderful colleagues who you'll meet in a minute, talking about the effects of COVID and the wisdom they had to share with me and those who were present on that panel about trauma felt so important that we wanted to also offer it thinking about other forms of disasters like the fires we all went through in the summer and fall. So I am going to just share their names and who they're affiliated with and allow them to introduce themselves a little more fully as we get into this conversation. We also on this, let's see, we have Alex Donovan, who is a healthcare chaplain and has worked in hospice and hospital settings. Derek Gardner, who is program manager for Colorado Spirit, which is the outreach program with Summit Stone Health responding to COVID, but has a great deal of experience and expertise with mental health in disasters. And Peter Strenning, who is a chaplain and spiritual care educator at Columbine Health. Also on the screen, you'll see my colleague Leah Behrens, who is our Zoom hero for the day. Phyllis Kane, who is our case management team chair and lead for the long-term recovery group. And Carrie oh my gosh, Carrie, I did it again. Olenek, who is our chair of the long-term recovery group and of Larimer County VOAD, Volunteers Active in Disasters. And we're very grateful to have you with us. So we might hear from Carrie and Phyllis either asking questions to our panel or offering what they've seen, having also worked with people going through disasters. All right, so without further ado, we will start with our first question, which is really very broad. All of you in your professional lives walk with people going through personal and communal traumas and disasters. And can you share with us what you have learned about that experience? And I think we'll go ahead and start with Alex.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thanks for putting this together. It's an honor to be here. I am a healthcare chaplain coming in from the hospital and hospice settings. So my expertise is not disaster relief, but I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and hopeful that some of what I've seen in other types of trauma work might add to the conversation and help create some framework. So recently, of course, during COVID, it's an ongoing traumatic event. So a lot of what I've witnessed is just survival, people needing more of that, the glass of water and the warm blanket, especially in the ICU setting. I feel like as we're in an ongoing, what we call a PTE, a potentially traumatic environment, where people may or may not come out of this time receiving what we would call PTSD or trauma. We're all kind of in that extended period of potential trauma. And so I see a lot of us in survival mode. And with that comes a lot of gallows humor, a lot of sense of exhaustion, whether that's all of us in COVID or people with acute loss in the hospital or the hospice settings. Just a lot of nebulous sense of exhaustion, which I think has been hard for people to name or to kind of break down. And as I've done some work trying to support my staff, the frontline workers who are also experiencing secondary trauma and their own sense of exhaustion, I've done a lot of research in moral distress and moral injury, which are terms that come to us from wartime settings, but I think have a lot to teach us during this pandemic, but also in the face of natural disasters. So Laura's asked me to share some slides on moral distress, which I'm gonna pull up here. Okay, can you all see that okay? All right, so I'll just go through these quickly. My hope is that these provide a framework that's helpful in thinking about different types of trauma, of disaster, and the way that we move through them. And I'm hopeful, again, since I'm not the expert in natural disaster relief and recovery, that those present and those listening might kind of add your own ideas to ways that moral distress might be coming into play. So start with moral injury. Moral injury is a psychological wound as a result of a morally transgressive act. And like PTSD or PTSI, this is a term and a constellation of symptoms that comes to us from military setting. And it applies very much to those of us who are forced to partake in or witness actions that in normal life would absolutely go against our morals or values. So if you find yourself thinking or saying, I would never have done this under normal circumstances or normal life, it's very possible that what you're experiencing is moral injury. Some examples that come to us from kind of the traditional wartime setting: being ordered to kill civilians, honestly being ordered to kill anybody, something that doesn't happen in normal life, but is part of what happens in wartime, or feeling guilty for relief that the bomb hit others and not you. In the healthcare setting, what we've seen a lot recently, having to remove a ventilator from an older patient and give it to a younger patient due to shortages in triage policy, or having to tell family members that they can't see their dying loved ones. And then in natural disaster settings, having to abandon people or animals or valuable, important structures in order to save other lives or to preserve your own life. So there's impossible choices that we're forced into. Kind of a notch down, but still very prevalent, is moral distress. This arises when we are aware of a moral problem, determine a remedy, but cannot act on it due to external or internal constraints. And you can think of this as kind of the strain of conflicting value system, being torn between the safe thing and the human thing, right? Do I protect my family, or do I hug that woman who's crying, right? Do I protect myself, or do I hug that woman? And all those micro decisions that we have to make. And when we say moral, it's not choosing between right and wrong, it's choosing between right and right, which is a lot of what we're caught between, all the, again, the impossible choices that we're faced with right now. Some examples from the healthcare setting, wondering, so if you're a frontline worker, wondering if you're jeopardizing your family by seeing patients with COVID, having to stay home from activities like protests, service opportunities, or social gatherings due to health concerns or concerns for your patients or family. From the pandemic setting for all of us, not just healthcare workers, feeling guilty for feeling relieved that the virus didn't take your loved one. So survivor's guilt. And that's the competing values of, am I not my brother's keeper? Am I not, my neighbor, there for my neighbors, but also preservation of life and feeling the relief of not being hit hard if you weren't. Sheltering at home because you're older or immunocompromised when you know that your skills could really be helping, whether that's healthcare or volunteering at the local soup kitchen. Not attending important family events or missing out on important time with family because you're also trying to protect them. I think all of us have been caught in that tension. And then for natural disasters, and I'm hopeful that those of you here and listening might add your own thoughts, but having to choose where to stay when being evacuated and balancing the risks of exposure to yourself or others with COVID, with the need to find shelter. Not being able to help others the way you normally would because of your own exhaustion, depleted resources, or logistical constraints. Asking for help when you might normally not, so conflicting values of independence and the need to take care of yourself or your family. Feeling guilty, again, survivor's guilt, that you're relieved that you weren't as affected as some. or feeling guilty for grieving what you perceive as small losses, so meaningful heirlooms, mementos, whatever it is, when others have suffered big losses. And then finally, there's this third category that I've kind of added that I'm just calling moral fatigue. And this is kind of moral distress over a long period of time, but it's that I think this is part of that nebulous sense of exhaustion that people are feeling from constantly weighing these decisions and risks and values from this extended, potentially traumatic environment that we're all in, and that many of you are in several layers. So constantly being torn between competing human needs and impulses, such as the need to protect and the need for human contact. Again, examples from healthcare. The repeated question of, do I take my mask off when a patient asks me to? I've had that many times. Do I hold the dying patient's hand? Do I hug the woman who just lost her husband? For all of us during the pandemic, should I hug my friend who's really sad, which is worse, leaving her alone or possibly infecting her? Whether we go to the grocery store, order curbside, delivery, whether we have friends over on the porch, if we do we let them use the bathrooms? Can we share food? All of those micro decisions that we're having to calculate constantly add up to our exhaustion. So it's that ongoing struggle to balance living our lives with being safe. And then for fire relief and natural disasters, constantly weighing the pros and cons of all our choices, both those made in the crisis and those that we are making in its wake. So should I offer for displaced friends to stay with me? If so, do we all wear masks? How much contact should I make in order to help others? And again, balancing the need for safety with the pandemic with the need to seek resources, find help, and provide help to others. Signs and symptoms, I'll read through these, but as I'm doing it, make a note and we'll kind of keep a tally just to see how many of these you identify with. These, of course, all overlap, but more in the moral injury category. Anger, pervading sadness, a sense of helplessness, loss of faith, and this might be faith in God, but it might also be loss of faith in a benevolent universe, in others, in yourself. Existential crisis, so who am I now that I've had this experience? I thought I was a good person, I thought I was a good nurse, neighbor, family member, the kind of person who always showed up in someone else's suffering. But this time it was impossible. And then flashbacks, intrusive thoughts or dreams, reliving an experience that brings you guilt or shame. So this is a big indicator of trauma, which moral injury really is a traumatic event. And then in the moral distress category, kind of the could have, would have, should have, constantly rethinking your decisions. Ruminating, beating yourself up, inability to stop thinking about or second guessing a decision you made. Feeling like you can't really rest, but also like you aren't doing enough. Guilt for feeling as sad as you do. And survivor's guilt. And then in that moral fatigue category, exhaustion, decision fatigue, choosing to withdraw or isolate because engaging feels exhausting and overwhelming. There's one final symptom that I think unites all of these, and that's shame. Shame for what you did or didn't do, for the ways you are, for what you are or are not doing, for choices you were forced to make, for the ways you aren't able to show up like you normally would, for having to say no, for having to disappoint people, for feeling so limited. So that's 15 total. I'm hoping that you can kind of just make a mental tally. And if anyone present during this conversation did make a tally and you're brave enough, I'd love it if you'd throw that in the chat box just to help us know we're not alone in experiencing some of these. Okay. And then we'll circle back to this conversation. I know Laura's going to ask us at the end about resources, but things that can help with moral distress and moral injury. Naming these things is a start. Mr. Rogers says if it's mentionable, it's manageable. So really just providing a framework, I think, helps us to know that we're not crazy, we're not alone, and there's a good reason for the way we're feeling. Talking to people who we really trust and who get it, who won't try to minimize what you're going through, won't try to give you a silver lining or talk you out of it. So, oh, you shouldn't feel so bad. But who can also point you towards your inner strength and your highest truths. I have a coworker who has called me several times and said, hey, I'm really in a shame spiral. I've got some moral distress going. Let me talk it out. She didn't need my advice. She didn't need me to tell her anything. She just needed to kind of have someone witness it who could say that's definitely moral distress, and I get why you're feeling that way. Practices of gratitude can really help kind of rewire our brains. And I've got some hyperlinks here that I know we'll also be sharing with folks. There's an app and also just kind of a texting service called 3 Good Things. It comes out of Duke University. The research has shown that this very simple practice of naming three things you're grateful for a day is on par with Prozac, and the effects last for up to a year in terms of helping us to kind of come out of the burnout slump and start to rewire ourselves to see the good again. Practices of mindfulness can also help with self-compassion, again, to combat that shame. And I find the teacher, Tara Brock, who has a lot of free meditations on her website to be really helpful. And then finding meaningful outlets for moral outrage and grief. So protest, activism, the arts, helping others, whatever that is for you. All right. That's all I had for now for moral distress and moral injury. Oh, and let me check the chat. Thank you. 12, 9, at least a dozen. Yeah, absolutely. Those are out of 15. I hope that makes the rest of you hearing this and present feel less alone.
All right, thank you so much, Alex, for getting us started. We're going to hand things off to Derek.
Wow, that was amazing. Alex does such a great job of eloquently stating each of those and really putting some meaning behind those. So thank you, Alex. And thank you everyone for having me join this panel today. Derek Garter with Summit Stone Health Partners, Colorado Spirit. Colorado Spirit is the outreach program that responds to usually natural disasters. This time we're responding to COVID and the global pandemic. And as kind of I talk about some of the experiences I've had personally and professionally, they kind of intertwine. And again, Alex has really highlighted a lot of great points. So thank you with that. I'll provide a quick physical example if those who are with us on the panel and those joining us can just practice this with me as we're going along. I want to speak a little bit to what it's like for emotional recovery after a major life-changing event, after a big stage of change in life. So if you wouldn't mind doing this as I go along and talk, if you can take your fist, one of your hands, and just close it into a fist and kind of squeeze it as tight as you can as I'm going through this. Piggybacking on what Alex was talking about, when we're talking about a life situation, major event that is threatening, and it kind of gets us to go to that place of fight, flight, faint, freeze, our body's natural reaction to a perceived threat or situation that puts those that we're in charge of or in care of at direct risk. And so when I'm thinking about that fight, flight, faint, freeze, I think everybody knows the big 2 ones. Fight, you're going to put up your dukes and you're going to get ready to go. That's our body's self-defense of I'm going to fight off this terror, I'm going to fight off this threat. Flee, obviously, sometimes you hear something really startling and you're ready to run away from the situation. I like to use this one as an example, like if you see a bunny rabbit out in the road or in the grass and they kind of stay right there, they do 2 of them at one time. They start with freeze and they say, if you don't see me, I can't see you, I'm not gonna be hurt. And as soon as you get close enough, that bunny takes off. So there's a good example for flight. And so that's also the freeze part. And the easiest one that I try to relate to that's for faint, if you think of a possum. When a possum plays dead, they're trying to tell the predators that I'm not going to get hurt because this predator thinks I'm not alive or I'm dead. And so essentially that predator is going to take off. Another one for freeze that a lot of people like is when you hear about that deer in headlights. As you're going around a curve, you see the deer and the deer is really caught off guard because it doesn't know what a car is, but it sees the headlights and so it freezes. And so sometimes it's to its detriment, or sometimes we can swerve around the deer and keep going. So those are our body's natural reactions to a perceived threat. So kind of as I'm going along with this, I'll talk about how it kind of helps. So as you kind of release your hand, you can tell from my hands, the color is, it's a little off. It's not as strong as this one. So you can release your hands now. So as I use a metaphor in comparison, our body's natural reaction in any of those fight, flight, faint, freeze reactions is to use adrenaline and cortisol. There's a lot of other stress hormones that go along with it, but the cortisol and the adrenaline help us focus and just use the frontal part of our brain. Everything else kind of shuts down, and we don't really need what I think about for long-term and abstract thinking is we don't really need to know how to do calculus in a time of natural disaster if we're threatened. We need to make sure to take care of ourselves and those perceived around us that we can care for. So kind of as I'm talking, you can kind of see the color coming back into my hands. It's kind of funny. I can kind of see where my thumb jabbed into my ring finger, and that little indent still, it's working its way back. And so we were holding our hands for about a minute, 20 or so. And it's going to take a little while for my hand to get completely back to the other side, just like my opposite hand. So my metaphor is when we're really stressed out, when we're in that moment of panic, the cortisol and the adrenaline kick in so we can survive, which is great if we have a perceived threat coming right at us. But what we know in natural disasters, as well as with this pandemic, we're kind of in this constant state of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Personally, having gone through a tornado, the tornado comes, it hits, it destroys everything, and then we're in recovery. For the last time I went through that, I had the experience, it was a tornado that lasted 52 minutes. When we think about the fires and the floods, those lasted either a couple of weeks or 6 or 7 days. And so you have this time period, kind of like my hands, as we go through the event, we've got that event happens, we've got our reaction to it. And so usually when we're talking about and thinking about recovery, it usually takes twice as long to recover from an event that happens. Big monkey wrench in this plan right now is we have a pandemic. This pandemic has continued to go on. And so for a lot of folks, the event happens at a different time, and we're going to recover and show our resiliency at different stages throughout either a calendar year and or how many times that pandemic has affected us. Sorry, back to my example. So as the cortisol and the adrenaline goes through our body, it kind of gets gunk in our brain and kind of gets gunk in our joints, in your stomach, in your back, in your neck, and you're going to start feeling these somatic complaints. So I relate it to an oil change with a car. If you think about taking your car in for an oil change, every 3,000 miles is, recommended. If you push it a little to 4,000, 5,000 miles, your car's still going to run. It's just not going to run at its optimal performance. And so as soon as you get that oil change in a car, I relate this a lot to taking care of ourselves. If we exercise, if we sleep right, if we're eating healthy, if we're staying in contact with our loved ones, which has been a struggle through the pandemic, and we're taking care of ourselves with work, then our body is going to work more towards optimal performance, similar to an oil change with a car. As soon as that oil change happens, it washes out all the gunk and that all gets kind of flushed out of the system. Exercise, sleeping, eating healthy, taking care of ourselves is the same thing as for us as people, our oil change. We're flushing out all that cortisol and that adrenaline, all that leftover stuff that gets kind of caught in our brain as we're going through this. And so if I can leave with one phrase for everybody, just kind of be very kind with ourselves. And a couple folks on this panel and have heard me say this before. Disaster response and recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. And so it's okay for us to take our time and acknowledge that this is going to take a while. It's better that we're thorough and that we take care of ourselves and our families and our loved ones rather than try to sprint through this and have it finished. Thank you.
Thanks to Alex and to Derek both for all they've provided, their insight. Appreciate that all very much, and am glad to be able to share what I know. And my sharing comes on the basis of my own experience currently in senior care. Prior to this, for a long time as a healthcare chaplain in a level 1 trauma center. And so I'm speaking out of my experience working with people in trauma, and the trauma is usually not over a long period of time, but trauma nonetheless. What I observed in people is initially a feeling of being stunned, in some kind of disbelief or disorientation as to what is happening. And then that transitions into, I think, what Derek was lifting up, a state of alert and a state of vigilance with the knowledge and the absorption of the fact that there is a threat around. And so I appreciated, Derek, just the exercise with the fist there. That was a very visceral kind of experience for me, what I have observed people to be feeling, that tenseness and tightness, and being on alert all the time, which naturally leads to fatigue. There's fatigue in trying to be on all the time, and especially on as a reaction to fear. On the other side of that, I've also experienced people, I think, naturally, as they find some way to manage that feeling of vigilance, beginning to call on their own resources and beginning to tap into some memories of other experiences they've had that they've survived, that they've gotten through, and to call on that and to lean on their own ability to do that. And I know later on we'll talk a bit about resilience, can say more about it then. But I have also observed that if people are not too disabled by fear, they also are able to put their hands on experiences that they've survived before, and draw on some of the confidence about surviving experiences that they're going through now. And the last thing I'll mention is, and I'm not sure what category this might fall into, but I've noticed that people greatly appreciate if they can get current and accurate information. That is a stress reliever and something that empowers people. And in the midst of crisis, and that's not always easy in the midst of a crisis, because there are so many moving parts, so much going on. But when they have accurate information, and the information does not have to solve the crisis or solve the problem, but whatever can empower people, even in small ways, to be able to rely on their own resources and their own resilience, whatever role information plays for that, that seems to be very useful for people. So I think I'll end my responses to this question with that.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all three of you for that great introduction to what you've seen as you have offered care to people going through disasters and traumas. All of you sort of started to touch on the overlay that living through the pandemic has added to, in particular, going through the wildfire season we all went through last summer, and the way that especially affected folks living in the evacuation areas, or those whose homes or properties were affected. How have you seen this pandemic change how people are experiencing other traumas and natural disasters? Peter, one thing I thought about when you were speaking was, this was my first natural disaster as a fire, with the fires, but what I heard from Carrie and Phyllis was how not having a DAC or a central location where evacuees could come get information made it so hard for everyone to connect and get access to that information or connection with each other. So what other pieces have the three of you seen, how the pandemic has affected our experience?
Jump in. I think just the isolation, I think in part has made people feel more siloed in their experience, more like there's something wrong with them for the way they're feeling, because we don't have the same level of connection to one another, that level of conversation just at the watering holes that would help us feel like we're all in this together. I think leaves us feeling like there's something wrong with us, rather than we are experiencing this trauma, that this thing is happening to us, it's still happening to us. I think the ongoing nature of the pandemic, I've noticed a lot of people feeling more exhausted now than ever, even as hope starts to be on the horizon. So it's kind of like what Derek was talking about with that. The adrenaline, the cortisol, they're starting to wear off as we actually ironically start to glimpse some hope. And because we're allowed to start to unbrace ourselves a little bit, we actually are feeling some of that exhaustion more. And I think there's no one unaffected by this pandemic. So our normal sources of support, our people that are our go-tos, are themselves depleted and worn out. And so it's hard for us to know where to turn necessarily, which adds to that isolation. And then I think finally, kind of what you're alluding to, Laura, with the centers, the lack of our normal rituals, our normal ways of gathering. So whether that's funerals for folks that have lost people, but also, we had a death of a neighbor on our street, and I remember kind of all of our neighbors just texting each other, but frozen, thinking, I would normally go hug, I would normally bring a casserole tomorrow. Those little rituals that we know how to show up for people, those are in some ways removed, and some of them are coming back on the scene now, but the rituals that help us know how to be human together in times of crisis have really been stripped from us. So I think we're frozen when we would have normally been able to move through some of this together.
I think that's my cue. Sorry about that. I was just making sure I wanted to take a couple notes and make sure I talked about it. Where did you have something?
Go ahead, Derek.
All right. So yeah, how's this affecting us, with the wildfire and COVID? I think as I'm thinking back on that, whether it was a shutdown in March that we kind of all experienced and everybody was staying home from COVID, and then we have the next season come through and it's the fires, and it's affecting, just like the pandemic and the floods and the tornadoes and stuff in the past, it's not just affecting one county. It's affecting so many different counties and so many people. And then you've got these layers that happen. Folks have been struggling with COVID. They have been, socially isolated. I know we talk about social distance. I think one point that I like to also refer to is staying physically distanced for the safety and health of ourselves and others, but we need to stay socially connected to folks. And so I was going to take that into the thought about how have different disasters impacted us. When I think about the tornado, going back to what Phyllis and Carrie were talking about in the beginning for the disaster response centers, as well as the distribution centers. When we had folks coming from all around the county in Weld County and Larimer County to the distribution center in Windsor, that's where folks got to make those connections. And then that's how we kind of got to spread the word of, hey, we've got this group going on, or we've got Phyllis over here with case management. They've got these resources this way and that way. And then you kind of fast forward it to the fires in 2012. I think one of the coolest things that we were invited to take part of was NOCO Rebuilding Network in Bellevue, and just watching professionals who were affected by the fires could also bring their expertise, whether it was plumbing, electrical, construction, and they were donating their time and expertise to help their fellow neighbors come together. And it was just such an amazing group just to watch that camaraderie that kind of went through with that. And then with the floods, I was thinking about like the commissioners meetings, when we had the coffee shop meetings. And again, it was, the different counties throughout Larimer County that were affected, but there were these rally points where community members could come together, whether it be professional or personal, and they just could share ideas and experiences, and then also step back and say, you know what, just last year we went through this fire and now we've had this flood happen. And so it was kind of those layers again, similar to COVID happening. And now you've got folks impacted by the fire. I do remember speaking with some folks up north who were very worried about the smoke that was coming towards them from Cameron Peak. And then they had the smoke coming down from the Wyoming fire. And they had some health concerns. And so the health concerns were, I have trouble with my breathing. I never get this right. COPD. And so they're worried about the smoke. But then if they were evacuated, they would have to go in town, and they had purposely stayed outside of town and away from everyone else If they go into town, now there's a potential of being exposed to COVID. And so it was this fine balancing act of how could they help support each other, making sure they were safe, but also physically safe. And it was just these compounding layers that folks were going through. And so kind of taking that just one step further, I want to provide a graphic. And so this is something that we get from our partners with SAMHSA and our state partners, CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, who's the partner with FEMA. And so when we describe the different reactions that folks have, these are very similar to the stages of grief, when we know that there's possibly pre-existing threats and or warnings that a disaster is going to happen. And then the impact phase is, I think, the most challenging part during COVID that has been now overlapped with the fires. With COVID, we had this big unseen threat coming. It wasn't like a fire, a tornado, a flood, where you could see that threat was coming at you and you knew where it was and where to avoid. With COVID, this virus it's unknown. We don't know where it's at and who has it until maybe it's already been contracted. And so you could have folks like when we shut down our agency in March, that kind of became a starting point for the anniversary as we kind of move through the different stages. The honeymoon wasn't always great. And Phyllis was there with us for the tornado. That's when you got to see your neighbors coming together, picking up the blown down fences, picking up the pieces of the house, just kind of everybody rallying around and just supporting each other. And that can only last for so long, kind of as we've hit upon, as this builds upon itself, the stress, the hormones, the physical exhaustion, the mental exhaustion, the physiological exhaustion happens. And that's when we're going to have kind of this crash. And so there's going to be, within this, there's going to be the disillusionment phase. And we're going to have, having taken inventory of what happens when it shut down versus the fire. We knew when the fire happened and when it ended. And so the ending point's the end of that event. With COVID, it still kind of overlaps and folks continue to kind of go back and forth. And so that kind of triggers into this disillusionment phase, as well as triggering events if we find something new has happened. If somebody's lost their job, they've lost their car, they've lost their home. The kids, I don't know, for those who are here on the panel and or watching, like my kids have been sent home for quarantine because of close contact at the school. And it happens at different events for them. My oldest son has had to do that twice now. And so it's just kind of this restarting of the phases. And so that also kind of makes it hard when we're talking about, maybe not my favorite term, but it's a term, the anniversary. When I think of anniversary, I think about celebrating my wedding anniversary. I think about my child who's about to turn 16. I think about my 25th high school reunion, which is coming up. Those are anniversaries to me. When we talk about this, we talk about acknowledgement. It's an acknowledgement of a time period that has passed. With the physical disasters, the natural ones, it's a year after the containment of the event. And then we acknowledge how much progress have we made over a year. With COVID, it's just that added layer of stress of we don't know when this is fully going to be contained. And we get these glimpses, we get these peaks that come. The vaccine's here, it's rolling out. Great, everybody's going to do it. And then we kind of hit, a trigger event. Not everybody wants to do it. There's hesitancy and we're not really sure what's going on. And so that's where it kind of ebbs and flows back and forth. And right now it's also coming right around the time for the acknowledgement. It's been about a year or a little longer from when the mandates were and the restrictions were really put into place. And so this can also be another time when we're working through grief. We're working through all that progress we made, then we have that setback, and now we're making some more progress forward. And so I'm sure you guys have seen it probably. There's a big difference between that physical rebuilding because you can see the end product. When we had that one house that was rebuilt completely, and at the time LTRC had the monies to be able to help put that home there, and you could see that product was done. You talk to the folks after the fires, and they rebuilt their structures. There's some disappointing times with the floods because folks got hit by the fires, and then the next year they got hit by the floods. And then a couple of years later, you can see the rebuilding process come to fruition. And so those are the parts that with a fire, it's a little easier to measure and quantify versus with COVID. It's, again, just that overlapping continuing effect. But it's also a time that we can acknowledge, hey, So from March of 2020 all the way through March, April of 21, these are the steps that we've made, to help ourselves, to help our community, to help, our neighbors. And with that, I don't want to monopolize time because I could do this all day long.
Peter, what would you want to add?
I'll pick it up and first to affirm what Alex and Derek said. I think they articulated it well. The language I had used was talking about our natural patterns of community and our natural patterns of resilience have been upset and continue to be upset by the pandemic. And our natural go-tos aren't there in the same way. And our resilience, it seems to me, has had to be generated more internally and often individually, which is, I think, a big challenge. I think the experience of community is often inspiring, and looking for sources of inspiration outside of community, perhaps internally, is a much bigger challenge. And where I've noticed it is, some folks, and maybe it's a spectrum, are more on the introverted side, and some folks more on the extroverted side. And for extroverts, I think the pandemic has really been difficult. My sister is quite the extrovert, and I've had a number of conversations with her, and her talking about how hard it has been not to have all those natural connections. So, and I think both Derek and Alex articulated that very well. So that's what I've been experiencing myself and experiencing with the people in my care as well.
Thank you all. Pivoting from the sort of deepening the ways in which this is, I just want to name and honor that this is a particularly hard moment, especially for folks who were affected very directly by the fires of last summer and fall. To do so without access to the community, as you heard from our panelists, is just excruciatingly hard. And so I hope from everything you've heard in the past of this recording that you feel validated if you're having a hard time. That you, as much as we have to be physically distant, as Derek reminds us, you are not alone in having really big feelings about, that's the language we use with our children, really big feelings about what is going on right now. So to pivot, as we move to the end of our panel, I'm wondering, Alex touched on it a little, Derek touched on it, Peter, you touched on it, but what are common ways you have seen people tap in to their own natural resilience, or resources that people under your care have found really helpful? Oh, and I'll call on someone so we don't play nose goes or something like that. Peter, let's go backwards. Let's put you on the spot.
All right. Yeah, often when I'm speaking, things go backwards, so that's good. As I made some notes about resilience, I think the way I've characterized resilience is, how do other people respond to their feeling of helplessness? And there's been a lot of helplessness with the pandemic, obviously. I can't imagine for people who have been experiencing the fires directly and had multiple evacuations, the feelings of helplessness must just be overwhelming at times. And as much as people are able to acknowledge that and still face it and find some ways to respond to it. And the population that I work with at present, people who are seniors, one of the ways they've done that is to call on their history and identify times where they've been experiencing helplessness in a profound way before, and calling on some of those strategies. The primary strategy, I think, is that they survived. They have survived before without knowing whether they would survive, and this is a generation who will talk about the Great Depression and World War II and other wars, being separated for families for years, sometimes being in the service, and the knowledge that they have survived that helps them to respond to the feeling of helplessness. I've noticed some people too have modified, I would say, their response to what it means to be independent, or the value of independence. And in our beings, I think, as human beings, in our culture, we value independence very much. We are now finding ourselves in situations where we do have to call on other people for help in ways that we're not used to. For example, being on Zoom. I can speak for myself that prior to COVID, I had very limited experience of Zoom, not none, but very limited, and wouldn't think of it as something I would do unless I had to do it. And now, like everybody else, you have to do it. And so there's some adaptation with that. And for me, the way I characterize that for me, and I think I've seen it in others, is that I have to let go of some of my need for independence and enter into interdependent relationships with other people, which I think for me has been a source of some growth. And I don't want to sugarcoat the challenge of doing that, but there is some potential to grow from not being too hyper dependent and thinking that I have to solve the problems on my own, or I can do this on my own, as I'm finding I can't do this on my own. I need to do it with other people. And then I will speak briefly to my experience of the way that some people have called on their own faith lives, people for whom religious faith, spiritual practice has been a resource for them all along. I have found people naturally tapping into that and leaning on that resource in this time, and I think doing that very helpfully and effectively. It's not the same for everyone every time, but that has been a resource, I think, that people have been able to name as something that sustains them and carries them through difficult times.
Thank you, Peter. Derek?
Yeah, Kara, did you want to jump in real quick?
No. I'm going to hand it over to Phyllis.
Just wanted to make sure to be. All right. Yeah, I was loving kind of everything that we've been talking about and hearing. I was gonna I don't know, something keeps ringing into mind. And I think about talking with my kids about this kind of stuff. And in the helping profession in the mental health realm, we use a lot of acronyms. And so one that keeps coming to mind is KISS. And so when I talk to my kids, keep it simple, silly, and so resiliency is there for sure. And how do we bounce back? Using those naturally occurring skills. I think kids are great with this because the younger they are, the more questions they have and the less filters they have. And so when something's going on, they're just going to say it. They're going to ask you a question or it's going to come out. And so helping them kind of relate with that and just being straight to the point, I think kids are resilient and they will get it. And you might have to use a couple examples to help them out, but just stand on point and explaining, here's what's going on. Here's why we have to wear the mask. Here's why we can't go, fishing over here because we're worried about those fires and we want to make sure we keep ourselves safe, but the firefighters can get in there and they can help out. And, just that, resiliency that naturally occurs with communities and friends and neighbors and family members, but also within a community, what you're seeing. So I know I kind of jumped all over the place with that one. But yeah, just kind of naming it for me is just keeping it simple. And, you know, talking with either kids, teens, families, adults, school members, staff, whoever it is, and just being there, not only to support them, but also hear what they're asking or saying.
Derek, I think you also did a great job of naming that at the beginning too, with how our oil change is first and foremost eating well, sleeping, moving our bodies, getting those basics down. I certainly know that when or especially early on in the pandemic, and then as the smoke kept coming, sleep was the first thing to go. And so focusing again on bedtime and not staying up scrolling on my phone.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't believe I skipped right over that one. The other name I'd give there is self-care. You know, taking care of ourselves. And this is funny because my little home makeshift office, I always keep this button with me that I got. Depends on the glare. Let's try that. So, oh my goodness. So it is. We're going to talk about our love life. You know, who are we at in relationship? How are we doing? Are we eating? Is this working? And then how's our sleep? So right there. And then how's our work? How's our environment? And then the last one is play. I think if we can always take time to enjoy things and experience some humor and some positive interactions with our family and friends, you know, even our coworkers for sure, because we got to enjoy what we're doing at work. So that's one that I've kept from the tornado that I always think about is how's your 5? Your love life, eat, sleeping, work, and play.
Thank you. We'll pass it on to Alex.
Awesome, thank you, Derek. You reminded me of I love the discussion with your kids and how you're kind of breaking it down into the why, and it reminds me of Victor Hugo's Man's Search for Meaning, and he wrote that out of his experience in the concentration camps, right? And if his takeaway really was, if we have a why, we can get through any what. And I think I'm actually going to give that a little more thought, reminding myself the why of why we continue to wear masks, why we continue showing up the way we do, why we also let ourselves off the hook, why we get that good sleep and eat, right? If I can remind myself the meaning, the why, we can get through the what. So thank you for that reminder. That was not on my notes here, but I think that'll help. A few things that have helped me mentally. I have a coworker now who likes to tell people to be less extraordinary. We are in survival mode. Be less extraordinary. Stop trying to do amazing. Let's just get through this. Let's try to get through it as best we can in one piece or pieces, right? And my kind of equivalent, I hit a point early in the pandemic when I just realized it out of desperation. I think I was talking to my therapist or spiritual director, and I said, I can't fix this. And it was such a relief to finally realize I cannot fix this. I can't fix it for myself. I can't fix it for anyone around me. And it was permission to survive this event. Yes, keep showing up for people, for myself, but we can't fix this in some ways. We'll get through it. We'll get through it stronger. We'll get through it with resilience, like Peter and Derek have shared. But this isn't all ours to fix necessarily. Let's see, a couple more things. I've mentioned a couple little hacks. And so the 3 good things, the app or the text, it's just you get a text every day for 14 days. That's it. I've done it. I loved it. I'm actually about to sign up for it again because we're hitting the 1-year mark of the pandemic, and it's time for me to refresh it. And it's just a little moment before bedtime where I pause and remember 3 things I'm grateful for and the role I had in those 3 things, those 3 good points of the day. And this is not, I have a friend who likes to say gratitude is a practice, not a feeling. So this is it's like a muscle that we have to keep working in order to rewire our brain. And it's not necessarily to gloss over what's hard. It's not to say, oh, it's not so hard. Look at these 3 good things. It's more to help. We're so good at seeing what's difficult. just evolutionarily, our brains are like Velcro to what's difficult. And we're like Teflon to what's been beautiful and good. So helping retrain our brains to remember and see what's been going well. And then mindfulness, again, like the Tara Brach exercises. And music, when we talk about that fight, flight, freeze, faint response, that's our sympathetic nervous system going into effect. And we've been in that for so long that we can almost start to have a new baseline. So part of our work right now is to do what we can to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our calming homeostasis, part of our brains and bodies, and find moments of calm. And music has a direct connection to the vagus nerve. It can help us activate that space. So can good, meaningful connections with people. So can mindfulness exercises. So giving ourselves a break from the threat, not to ignore how hard it is, but just to help ourselves find some pause and some calm.
Our plan is to put some links to some of these resources that our panelists have offered in, if you find this on Facebook, in the comments, or somewhere in the text below the video, wherever this is offered. So I hope you'll check those out. Derek, I'm wondering if I can bring it back to you to talk a little bit about Colorado Spirit, because that you and the team you manage are another resource people can turn to. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. Even though our primary function had been set as a COVID response, I think Alex definitely hit it, and Peter has talked about it too. Everybody in Larimer County, everybody in Colorado, throughout the world has been affected by this. And so there's no way to say that more than likely everybody's been affected by this, I should say. But it's impacted us, across the board, up and down, finances, personal, it doesn't matter, our race, our gender, our sex, our what have you, every portion of the world has been affected. So sorry, bringing it back, Colorado Spirit, yes, we are, I like to describe it as a bridge emotional support. It is not traditional outpatient therapy. It's not ongoing intense therapy. It's the emotional support. Sometimes folks just need a chat. Sometimes a phone call or a video session works for them. We offer group settings, but we've kind of gone away from that because there are a lot of sports out there and we don't want to kind of muddy the water. But going back to, how can we support each other in a way that's not therapeutic, because that's not what our program is right now. We have developed a Zoom meeting called Escape from COVID Mountain. And so it's basically just giving an hour platform for folks to just kind of take a break from everything that's going on. And this is completely open to folks who've been affected by the wildfires, whether it be in Larimer County, Grand County, Boulder County, because we've noticed that through the COVID response, we have other programs in the state that have something really good and really designed for a certain request. And what I mean by that is we have a number of folks that are Spanish speaking and hold different platforms for folks, not just Spanish speaking. Mandarin has been one that we've seen a really high need for down in Denver. And so there's teams in our state that really specialize in that. And then we have our partner agency down in Boulder, Intuits, and they have groups and platforms set up for working professionals. And so that is their main focus, and they're really supportive of that. They've got the personnel who have that training that can be that support. And unfortunately, here in Larimer County, we've got a number of us who have responded to at least one wildfire. And now we're on our number 2, and we've gone through these natural disasters. And so it's definitely a component that, the last component we do is helping find those resources and try to get those referrals to folks like Phyllis and Carrie that are here to support not just COVID, but also folks affected by the troublesome fire, as well as Cameron Peak, as well as the Larimer Fire and all the wildfires, I should say.
Thank you, Derek. And you brought up Phyllis. So Phyllis, I am wondering if there's anything else you want to add, especially as we talk about resources for resilience and recovery.
Resources. Oh. What I had a different train of thought in that moment, Laura, and I'm going to go with this, and then I'm going to jump off, but I want to tell everybody how helpful this was to me personally. I put a big number in the chat box for how I think the last year has affected me. But what I realized as we went through the whole hour was that the fire impacted families, and so I only work with fire impacted families, right? I'm haven't been working COVID. Well, that's another story. Actually, last year I helped all COVID clients all last year. But I'm realizing how everybody impacted in the fires are twice as hit by all of this. After a normal natural disaster, after a tornado, a flood, a fire, folks do feel survivor's guilt. They feel isolated from their communities because they aren't where they used to live. Everybody has to separate and go to other places. So they don't experience some of their normal rituals that Alex talked about. So that's already part of their disaster experience. And then if you add this COVID on top of that, I think that they're probably just feeling really crummy in many ways and not able to put a name to why they are. And so in this moment, that's making me very sad. We speak to people all the time, though, who seem resilient. They're on their way to recovery. They're making plans to rebuild homes. We have people who have turned down resources we provided because they want to give them to their neighbor instead. So a generous spirit, I've seen that. But I just think that probably folks are struggling in ways that we all don't see because the pandemic has separated us all into different locations. And the fire impacted families, they can call Colorado Spirit, as Derek mentioned. But Derek, I think you'd probably say, in agreement with me, there aren't as many available resources for the fire survivors this time, just by nature of how we're structured right now in this pandemic environment. So thank you all very, very much, though.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for what you added. Oh my goodness. I am going to take, once again, so much away from just getting to be a part of this panel. And the wisdom our panelists shared, the wisdom Phyllis shared, those of you who are watching at a later date, however you sit in relation to the fires, however living through this pandemic has affected you, I hope you are hearing encouragement to be gentle with yourself, encouragement to ask for help, and a real strong statement of how deeply this has affected all of us. And I think Alex is so right that because of the pandemic, every trauma we've experienced through the past year, to some extent, as we come out of the pandemic, we might feel more deeply because we've still been on that adrenaline rush for a year. And so be gentle with yourselves, be gentle with the people you're around. You're not alone. Any other final thoughts from our panelists?
Just an
I'd
honor
just
to be
like
part of
to,
this.
yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, and thank you for all the good work that's going on behind the scenes, and it's reassuring, inspiring to me to know how hard people are working to help those who really are having a hard time now. So thank you.
And I was just saying it's an honor to be part of this group and part of this discussion. So thank you. Thanks to those who made it happen.
Totally agree. Thank you all for allowing me to be here and be a part of this and just hear so much wisdom. I do really, really appreciate it. And it is validating because we're all still going through this. I guess My parting breath would go back to, self-care, making sure that we take care of ourselves, because recovery is a marathon, not a sprint.
Derek, I found these postcards that are called empathy postcards, and they're meant to be sort of a counter statement to sympathy postcards. And one of them is, anyone who said it's a marathon and not a sprint doesn't understand how much you hate running. And it just, yes, that feels even more accurate to going through trauma and what recovery is.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. And Alex, I love the little office buddy.
All right, everybody. Well, I think we are going to stop the recording. Before we stop the recording, we are going to thank Lita, our Zoom host and behind the scenes hero. Thank you so much. All right. And we'll go ahead and stop our recording.